Mr Chair.
Holly Walker.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. And I'd like to thank the previous speaker, the Honourable David Cunliffe, for raising the issue of intergenerational equity in relation to the student loan scheme, because it is indeed the elephant in the room when we look at this student loan scheme amendment bill. And I'm speaking probably, Mr Chairman, as one of the few speaking on this bill who has a current student loan and who is therefore qualified to speak about the provisions in this bill. So I'd like to thank that member for raising that important issue. And indeed, it is, for many people of my generation, a significant detriment to starting their lives, to begin their lives as families, to consider the prospect of home ownership, to start their adult lives with the equivalent of a significant mortgage hanging over their heads. Where I differ from the Honourable David Cunliffe, Mr Chairman, is that in the Green Party's opinion, there actually are some things wrong with this bill, and that's why we oppose it and will continue to oppose it. And we see this bill as part of the gradual erosion of the fairness of the student support scheme. And I think we've seen under this current government in the last 5 years or so a very damaging trend in gradual amendments to the student loan scheme, which harm students and graduates, disincentivise tertiary students from studying, particularly those from low incomes, and incentivise graduates to move overseas. Now, in my contribution, Mr Chairman, I'd like to look at two elements of Part 1 of the bill which are concerning to the Green Party. The first of these is one of the two major changes that this bill makes, and that is the provisions for greater information sharing with customs. Mr Chairman, the Green Party has no problem per se with encouraging overseas borrowers to keep up with their student loan repayments. But the big problem we have with the provisions in this bill, which make it easier for information to be shared with customs and to track down students at the border, graduates at the border, to ensure that they're meeting their repayment, is that it comes in the context of the reduction of the repayment holiday from 3 years to 1. And I note that the Minister is in the chair. This Minister introduced the 3-year repayment holiday, Mr Chairman, and it was a very good idea and one which we were very happy to support. The reason we supported a 3-year repayment holiday is that we think provisions in the student loan scheme need to reflect how young New Zealanders spend time overseas. What we know is that the average young New Zealander who goes on an OE or travels and works overseas for a period of time does so for more than 1 year. That is the typical New Zealand OE experience, and while doing that they gain skills and experience which they bring back to New Zealand when they return, and there is a net gain to New Zealand of their return to New Zealand. However, there's a big if over that, because the if is if indeed they do return to New Zealand. And Mr Chairman, our concern with bringing in these punitive provisions to allow customs to share information and track graduates down at the border, as this bill does, in the context of only a 1-year repayment holiday, is it makes it significantly more likely that many graduates will be pinged with penalties and interest, because they do tend to be overseas for more than 1 year. And this creates a real disincentive for them to return to New Zealand. If their student loan bill is racking up penalties and interest, there's a real disincentive for them to return. And we know from talking to New Zealanders overseas who are in this position that many worry about the size of their student loan when they return. That's why the 3-year repayment holiday was such a good idea when this minister introduced it. But now that it has been reduced to only 1 year, it's significantly, we in the Green Party think that it will make it very difficult for graduates to meet their repayment obligations when they're overseas, and we can't support provisions which make it more punitive and more difficult for them and easier to track them down in the context of only a 1-year repayment holiday. It was a very short-sighted decision, and for that reason we can't support those provisions in Part 1 of the bill. The second part of Part 1 I wish to address in my contribution in this committee stage is the transitional provisions and regulation-making powers inserted by the Select Committee. Mr Chair, these provisions added at Select Committee stage allow the Inland Revenue Department to administer the changes in the Student Loan Scheme Amendment Bill. But what we have seen, and as I've mentioned, this bill comes in the context of a trend of small but punitive adjustments to the student loan scheme over a number of years, is that there have now been so many small and complicated changes to the student loan scheme that IRD's computer systems and administrative systems are groaning under the weight of them, and there is a real question mark, Mr. Chairman, a real question mark, thank you, Mr. Chairman, about whether those systems are sufficient and are able to actually administer the changes that are being made in this bill. And we've seen a similar difficulty recently with the same systems, with the changes to child support. Now, clearly, Mr. Chairman, the IT system at IRD is in urgent need of an upgrade. And what we've seen is a student loan scheme that has been tampered with so many times that that system can no longer cope with the complicated array of amendments it is expected to administer. So the government's answer to this, and this is the provision that has been inserted by the Select Committee, is to introduce wide-ranging regulation-making powers by order in council to allow for transitional provisions or any changes that need to be made at IRD to administer these changes. Now, Mr. Chairman, we have a real concern in the Green Party with this model of lawmaking, and we think that it represents a trend that we have seen in this House since the introduction of the Canterbury earthquake recovery legislation, introducing wide-ranging regulation-making powers under order in council, that when there are tricky issues for a government to administer or deal with, instead of bringing them back to the House for the proper parliamentary scrutiny and due process, it's easier just to shove in an order in council provision and deal with it that way. And that's a real problem, and we think the changes in this bill are representative, and these transitional provisions and regulation-making powers in Part 1 inserted by the Select Committee are symptomatic of that approach, and it's a very concerning approach that we have seen from this government. Now, I note that the Labor members of the committee also expressed their reservation about this at the committee, and I'm sure we'll hear from them about that. But it seems to me, Mr. Chairman, to represent a very concerning model. So those two changes, Mr. Chairman, the transitional provisions and the information sharing with customs and tracking down borrowers at the border, are the two parts under Part 1 I wish to address in this contribution. As I said at the outset of my speech, the elephant in the room, of course, is the $12 billion of debt that is now on the backs of the people of my generation who had to pay for our education and take out a student loan. And instead of taking the opportunity to enhance the fairness of the student support system, and there are many ways to do that, Mr. Chairman, this bill instead contributes to a gradual erosion of the fairness of that scheme and a damaging trend that will harm students and graduates, disincentivise tertiary study and incentivise those graduates to move overseas or to stay overseas if they are there already.
Tracy Martin.
Kia ora. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise on behalf of New Zealand First to speak in support of this